Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the OK Grognard Show. It is Wednesday, November 18th, 2020, 10 a.m. Central in beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Well, it's Wednesday, and that means it's campaign discussion day. But what are we going to discuss? So there's the age-old discussion of Sandbox versus Railroad. At least that's how it's usually framed. Though I think Sandbox versus linear is charged enough. It's usually applied to individual adventures, although campaigns can be this way from top to bottom, can be described this way from top to bottom. Adventures are obviously smaller, discrete units of a campaign, ultimately, even if that's only in retrospect. One could play a handful of adventures with a group, and if they're using the same characters throughout, or if the premise is that there's some institutional memory, let's say they play 5 adventures and they're all with individual characters, but they're generationally the descendants of characters that came before. We play one adventure, and then their next generation goes out and plays the second adventure, and they're meant to be the offspring in some way, or there's meant to be some link between the PCs from that first adventure to the next. And that's a kind of a neat way. You can set up an adventure like that, but there's got to be a certain linear nature to it, because by setting it up that way, and this is partially why I'm describing this particular adventure campaign premise, you're assuming that there's got to be offspring for the previous adventurers. Now, maybe they all have offspring before they go on that adventure, and so that's a done deal. But you're also assuming that those players don't mind having that aspect in their background, in the background of those characters. If they're making up the characters themselves and they don't want to have offspring in their background, then that kind of foils the whole thing right from the get-go. Unless it's enough for your premise to only have one of the characters have offspring. But indeed, no matter which way that falls out, you've determined that there's going to be some sort of institutional memory from group to group over the course of those, even if it's 1 and not 5, even if they're not all 5 offspring, somehow information has been passed down. And it's just in the very act of figuring out how that's going to happen. No matter which way it does, it has a certain amount of predeterminism to it that creates a sort of linear nature to at least those two. You're drawing a line, literally drawing a line between those two adventure groups, and doing it in advance, regardless of anything else that's chosen or that happens in the game. Now, I am a proponent. Let me be clear about how I'm defining this relationship between these two styles of play. Sandbox being this sort of open setting in which the PCs are thrown in and they just do whatever they want. You've not decided what they're going to do. You're not decided where they're going to go. And that is the premise of a sandbox. It's an open setting, and they have carte blanche to go wherever they want to go. The linear setting is set up such that, much as what we just described, events happen, whether it's as tight as scenes or large-scale events are going to happen in succession. You've determined these things in advance. There is a timeline, and the PCs are put at the beginning of this, and they're moving toward the end of this. And that's going to happen, and you've determined this for your, either in a smaller version of an adventure or in a larger version of a campaign. It's all worked out. I got to keep my hand on camera, huh? So you know that, so that there's an end to the line? Is that the... Anyway, obviously, even as I described that, you might see where I'm going with this, in that it's my belief that the completely linear campaign and the completely sandbox campaign are on two ends of a spectrum. They're both at the very extreme. In their purest form, the sandbox and the linear adventure are both at the far end of spectrums, and nothing, no campaign, no game, no adventure is ever completely out to the far end. Because if you have something at the far end of this, you've determined absolutely everything that can happen, in which case you're just telling a story. Right? It's impossible for you to actually play a game at the far end, at the linear end of that spectrum, because you're not playing a game anymore. You're just telling a story to whoever's listening. At the far opposite end of that, at the sandbox end of that spectrum, if you've created this thing, you can never create a perfect sandbox, because you can't put an infinite amount of things in any sandbox. Right? There's always going to be something that's determined that becomes a premise for whatever game you run, whatever campaign, whatever adventure is going to come up short of being at the far end of the spectrum, because there are some premises, whether it's character choices, the rule system you choose becomes a limit, because to play this game, do you just gather players? The players that you allow into this game create something that won't be a completely free agency choice of the other players. Just by inviting two people, and I know this is meta, but meta is part of it. Just by inviting two people, and because this person didn't get to choose this person, or decide they couldn't, and this person same, you've made a choice that keeps you off the end of that spectrum. So everything, every game that ever gets played never hits the far outsides of that spectrum. Always comes somewhere in between. And now it's just a matter of figuring out where in between. Good to see XL. Dank, how you doing? Thanks for both coming out today. Appreciate you popping in. We're talking about Sandbox versus Railroad. I think that's pretty clear where my head is at. And I believe that's true no matter how most people define railroad, sandbox, linear, whatever. I think it still fits somewhere on that spectrum. Because any game is going to have some choices, which includes this end of the spectrum, or moves whatever you're playing on the spectrum in that direction. And some decisions, whether it's just telling the players the color of the sky, is predetermined, moves it in some way in the direction of linear. So everything, every element, everything that happens while you're playing edges it along the spectrum in one direction or another. So it's perpetually fluid. When the DM makes a decision, when the game master, facilitator, referee, crypt keeper, whatever, makes a decision, that you're going to make a decision, that the players are going to be able to make a decision, it slides it a little bit towards Sandbox. When they make a decision and the game master hears what words they use and makes any sort of decision of their own based on that determined consequences, when the players take any action, it's up to the game master to devise some set of potential consequences and either choose one of them or allow it to be random. But just in the process of deciding what the potential consequences are, now the GM's obviously going to say, well, these are the obvious consequences. What about the inobvious ones? What about the ones the GM can't think of? Just the very act of not being able to think of an infinite number of consequences tightens up how many consequences there could be, and thereby slides it a little bit toward linear. Just the very nature of only being able to come up with so many consequences. Now, this is a hypothetical, this is a theoretical discussion. So resist the urge at this point to say something like, well, if you had to come up with infinite consequences, you'd never get around to playing the game, so we have to discard that. No, this is a theoretical discussion. In our theoretical discussion, a game master can immediately and in an instant think of an infinite number of potential consequences if they're the ideal DM and can move everything toward the ideal sandbox. But we know that's not possible. So the limit and how far or how little the game master can move the game toward that sandbox, as much as they might desire to, is limited by the number of potential consequences that game master can come up as consequences off of any given action that happens in game that is proposed by the players. It's as I say, a constantly fluid situation during gameplay. It's also, of course, the game master, by the very nature of deciding to run a game, has to at some point not anchor the game, but give it a starting point as to where it's going to be on that spectrum, consciously or unconsciously. So When a game master decides, I'm going to run a sandbox, what they're really saying is, I'm going to run a game and I'm going to try to put it as close to the sandbox edge as I can come up with. Now, of course, as soon as they make any sort of decision, even if it's ever so close to the ideal sandbox, as soon as they make any sort of decision, what rule set am I using? Well, that makes it somewhat linear because these are the choices that are going to be outlined for the players that they can make for their characters, for character creation, for how they should be thinking about the setting. What about setting? Well, I've made a setting. It's a medieval fantasy setting. It's my Grimwald setting, for instance. Whoop, well, we've just moved it closer to linear because I've already determined those players through their characters are going to be exploring this particular setting. Can they go somewhere else? Maybe I'm allowing for that, but just by starting them there, I've predetermined something about this game and therefore taken it a little bit away from the sandbox. Maybe very far away from the sandbox. Maybe I've determined that my entire game is going to play out in one dungeon. Mega dungeon, okay, it's cool, it's big, it's exciting, it's fun to explore. We're playing old school, Well, there's another decision I've made, right? Just by taking that sort of a microcosmic genre of medieval fantasy role-playing, the mega dungeon, once I've determined that, I've moved it further away. They're going to be in this tighter campaign setting now. It's not a big old world. It's not a big old universe. Can they go outside that? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. If they can't, we're moving it further away from sandbox and more toward linear, right? So this becomes the constant shift back and forth. Every time I allow a decision, every time I allow something more than what I can personally decide, or every time I come up with something new in the moment extemporaneously, it can shift more towards sandbox and away from the other side. So where are we at? It's the beauty of tabletop. It's only limited by your imagination, and that's the key, isn't it? Is what are the limits of any imagination? Now, this is not to say that that this is a good or bad situation. All imaginations are limited to some degree. Nobody has an infinite imagination. Granted, those imaginations are fed, right, by your own experiences, by what you've read, by what you've learned. Nurture versus nature. Your own personal upbringing and being able to, and then of course there's your own abilities. Different brains are going to be wired different ways. How many associations can you make? How quickly can you make them? How malleable are you in taking any sort of data or input and adjusting it in a way that it can be useful in a game? Perhaps there's a hurdle there that you can't jump with certain things. Maybe you can't watch a nature documentary and think of it in terms of the game that you're creating. Maybe it just doesn't translate for you. This data doesn't automatically make you think of how you can use it in a game, or at least when you're in the game, you don't even subconsciously remember something from that input source, so you can't translate it that way. It doesn't mean that your game will fail just because this is one thing, one hurdle you can't jump over, because there's plenty of others. Obviously, the very act of proposing to run a game is in and of itself a hurdle that a lot of people either don't want to jump or can't. And by all means, when we're talking about this, as I've been talking about this, I've been talking about this in regard to what the game master can bring to the table when it comes to setting and gameplay and all of that. We haven't even touched on picking up an adventure or a campaign setting that's been written by someone else and making it your own, right? So there's that added something else. When we talk about a game master being able to use all this outside data and outside input sources to bring them to the table to infuse their game with any of this information, whether directly or not. We need to also talk about the fact that there's plenty of material out there to feed the game master, and maybe that's the best way to approach running a game. So if you determine I'm going to use this setting by Dank Plays Games, all right, who happens to be in the stream chat here. So if I'm going to take a setting by, I'm going to call you a company. I'm not even sure if you are. Maybe this is just you using that name. But if that were a company name and you had created a setting and somebody else was to utilize that setting, just by choosing that setting, of course, they move further away from the sandbox end of the spectrum and more toward the linear, because these are their data points now. These are the ones they're going to share with the players, and the structure under which the players are going to have to make their decisions, or within this pool of data points, they're going to have to pick out information that allows them to make decisions. Whether that's an entire setting or an adventure. And once again, the whole idea of the linear adventure is, here's what we're going to do. And we talked about how that's in its ideal form, in its purest form, just somebody telling a story. You don't get to make any decisions. Here is what's happening. In the railroad adventure, I create a series of scenes, and these are what you're going to go through, and I'm going to describe them. And I only have one set of scenes, and they happen in a sequential manner. So regardless of the decisions you make within the discrete individual scenes, this is the next scene you're going to. So I've done that. Now maybe I've done a sort of non-linear thing where I've created two possibilities. So I've got my original scene, and then I've got two that I can go to from there. But somehow, if it's linear, I'm making you get back to here eventually. Where are we at? Here, we'll put it over here. There we go. So I'm going from here to here, and even if I have one way and another way to get there, it's still two branches of the same eventual railroad, right? So that's something I've determined in advance, and that's something that moves me along the spectrum closer to the full stop linear adventure. Play games on running a game. Think you're going to buy a module? Absolutely. Check them out. What system are you going to run? Have you made that determination already? Welcome, George. Good to see you, buddy. I should mention, while you're coming up, give me some information on what you're thinking about running there. 5e? Okay. There's a lot of adventures out there for 5e for sure. DM's Guild has huge selection of adventures to run. For those of you who are checking this out, if you're following this during the live broadcast, do follow the Twitch channel and chime in on the stream chat, because when you do that, I get to put you on a little list. And my little list says, you're all good people. I put you on the list because once you've done this, I can determine that you're not a bot. And by being able to know you're not a bot, you can be in the running for a giveaway I do every week. I'll give away something on Monday to somebody at random from the previous week. Excel. There you are. Okay, I got you on the list too. I'm assuming Dank plays games that you click the follow button, so I've got you on the list. I always check it against the followers later, so if you don't get around to it, that's okay. But these are the people that can have the potential giveaway. You don't have to buy anything, whatever. But got a couple of skull dice and a six-siders and a D6, Lake Geneva Games D6 on the offing for this week that we're taking down here in Lake Geneva to the Gary Gygax Memorial Stone. And we're kept on there, put on there, picture taken. Where's my... Oh, you know what? I could do this real quick. Let me just pop this up here. There we go. We'll just do that. All right. Switch over real quick. Oop, that's not what we want. I'm on the wrong level. There it is. See, check it out. These are little skulls. The pips are actual skulls. Lake Geneva Games is on the die there. So, just giving away a pair of the skull dice with the Lake Geneva Games die. They've all been put on the stone. And there you go. So if you're ever in the chat stream, just make sure you chime in. Make sure you're following the channel and you're in for the potential giveaway. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for popping out today. We're done for the day, I think. I just got to do the closing out ceremonies here, so to speak. I want to thank you all for popping out, following the channel, and all the rest of that. Got all the G's in there. Thank you, Excel. It's appreciated. This is a topic we'll revisit. We'll talk in more specifics, and we'll figure out where we're at with certain individual settings and styles. We'll talk about various aspects somewhere along the line of how decision points move you along the spectrum one way or another. And we'll see how that goes. But not tomorrow, because tomorrow's GMing tips. 10 a.m. tomorrow, and every day we do a show. Friday's Building Adventures. Saturday's GM Reviews. That's where we take something, usually from outside the game, and we discuss it from the viewpoint of a game master and what we might bring to the game. Remember, we talked about those outside influences. Rules Retrospective on Sunday. We do weekly news and announcements on Monday, cartography and world building on Tuesday, then back around the horn to next Wednesday with more campaign discussion. Also, If you're catching up with us on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Give us a thumbs up on any videos that you watch and enjoy. And feel free to make comments, give us an attaboy, constructive criticism. It all helps make the show better, and we appreciate when you take the time to do it. This has been the OK Grognard Show from beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Bye-bye.